Good evening, everyone, and greetings. Happy Black History Month. My name is Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera, and I am the Director of Equity Inclusion here at the Washington Township Schools. Our district equity leadership team has hosted a series called Learning in Community, where we bring our staff and families together to learn about equity in action. This year, we have hosted webinars that have pertained to high ability, implicit bias education, as well as supporting LGBTQ+ youth, and many other topics that are relevant to the experiences of our students, as well as our efforts to create affirming environments. And tonight, we are going to have an unapologetic and intentional conversation about race, racism, justice-centered work, as well as Black excellence with Dr. Sonya Paul, the author of Stamp for Kids. Dr. Sonya Paul's research and work stem from an unyielding commitment to anti-bias and anti-racist pedagogy and practices. Sonya leads professional development with educators around the world, spotlighting the relationship between teaching, literacy, and equity. She supports educators in developing the capacity and will to continually examine themselves and to critically inquire into their own practices. In the world of professional development, Sonya is unique. As a former middle school classroom teacher for 20 years, she recognizes the common and local challenges that educators face. She also understands kids, specifically how to use asset-based pedagogies that honor their identities and support their individual needs. Further, Sonya knows that it takes to forge relationships with caregivers and communities in order to cultivate trusting learning environments where all students thrive. Sonya's expertise is in using her scholarship to develop curricula that advances the work of anti-racism in all aspects of schooling. She spotlights and centers issues related to race and racism, providing faculty and staff with the language and tools to facilitate transformational conversations and instruction with students about race. Her role as the Director of Diversity and Equity at the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, Sonya leads professional development for staff developers, teachers, and administrators, and guides the development of culture responsive and anti-racist curriculum for elementary, middle, and high school students. She is the host of the Black Creators Series, a collaboration with the Teachers College and Candlewick Press, where she leads educator-focused discussions and highlights the powerful ways the work of Black authors and illustrators can live in classrooms. Sonya is the co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity and Literacy, an annual institute that provides professional development that supports educators around the globe in using their power and position to transform systems, including individual classrooms, districts, and communities. As a senior advisor of the Heinemann Fellows, Sonya guides an accomplished group of educators as they engage in individual action research that addresses pressing issues and challenges in the field of education. Sonya has adapted the #1 New York Times bestseller, Stamp for Kids, published by Little Brown Books for Young Readers, which has earned star reviews by Kirkus and School Library Journal and was selected as one of the best nonfiction informational books of 2021 by Parents Magazine, School Library Journal, and the New York Public Library, as well as Chicago Public Library. Stamp for Kids was selected by the National Council for the Social Studies as a 2022 Notable Social Studies Trade Book for Young People. She is the co-author of 4 published books by Heinemann. We are so excited and honored to have Dr. Sonya Paul with us this evening. Our district equity leadership team has prepared some questions for Dr. Sonya Paul that will guide the conversation this evening. Additionally, with the remaining 10 to 15 minutes, we do want to provide time for our audience to ask questions that we will answer as we review those questions in the chat. If you hear something this evening that resonates with you, that speaks to you, that moves you as a viewer, we encourage you to use our hashtag WT, the number 4, equity, WT for equity, and share those experiences online, whether through Twitter or Facebook. We'll look for the hashtag throughout the evening, and we will make sure to share the collective learning that has happened within this space. Welcome, Dr. Sonya Paul. We are so excited to have you join us. We are honored to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Erica. I'm so happy to be here. I was just thinking I should have given you the short version of that bio. I'm so sorry that you had to read all of that. But thank
Incredible
you.
work.
It's a pleasure.
We're so glad to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's start talking about the book Stamped for Kids. Share with the audience how you got involved in that project and writing that body of work that has been so transformational in the lives of young readers across the country.
Yeah, so I guess, I partnered with Little Brown Books on an NCTE panel one year. And that's sort of my relationship with how my relationship began with Little Brown Books. And then a representative from the publisher said to me, there's a project coming up that we would like for you to work on. That project ended up being Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Dr. Ibram Kendi. And what they wanted was for me to create an educator's guide, really to write curriculum that could support that book. So I did that. And then I hosted an NCT members night, facilitating a conversation with Jason and Ibram for members. And there had been, lots of discussions around, a desire for a younger version of the book. And so many months later, I was asked to adapt Stamped, and I was stunned, but obviously honored. I knew the book. I knew Stamped, Jason Reynolds' version of Stamped cover to cover, and my scholarship is also in teaching about race and racism in K through 12 schooling. So I think, those were some of the criteria, if you will, or the characteristics that made me well suited for adapting Stamped for Kids. So yeah, that's kind of how I got there. Yeah.
Excellent. I love that you were able to collaborate with Dr. Ibram Kendi and Jason Reynolds. I'm sure that had to be a powerful experience.
Yeah. I'm incredibly honored and humbled that they would trust me with their scholarship, with their brilliance. And I'm incredibly proud of what we've created, and the acknowledgments that Stamped for Kids is receiving in the literary world.
It's amazing work.
Thank you.
And so I mentioned earlier that we're going to have an unapologetic conversation about race tonight. And you know that we could probably talk about this for quite some time as two scholars who are deeply immersed in anti-racist pedagogy.
Yep.
And so I'd love for you to help frame for our audience tonight terms such as race and racism. So for example, before I got deeply immersed into this work, I believe that racism in my earlier stages of activism was more about the interpersonal actions between people. It was about the language, the racial slurs, the violence that you would see overtly within communities. But over time, I've learned more about the systemic nature. And so I would love for you to unpack for us the terms race and racism as we begin to frame the conversation for this evening.
Yeah. And, I so appreciate that you are creating a brave and vulnerable space where we can both talk about just some of the murkiness that we've experienced as a result of living in a nation where race and racism is typically silenced in education. So if you schooled here, it's not surprising to me that so many of us as adults would have limited or uninterrogated understandings about the meanings of these words, race and racism. As you mentioned in the very long bio, I was a classroom teacher for 20 years. And I was a classroom teacher in a predominantly white, affluent school district. And my fifth and sixth grade students could talk about race often better than some of the adults in their lives because it was a central part of the work that I did in my classroom. And my students could explain that race is socially constructed. They could explain that that means it's all made up for one purpose, to create a hierarchy in our society where white people are at the top and everyone else is beneath them. And while race isn't real, racism is. And we need all students to be that clear in their understandings of what race is and what race isn't. And then the kind of teaching that can happen in schools should help students to develop their racial consciousness by also learning that race isn't just physically and socially constructed, that it's also historically and legally constructed. And this involves learning, understanding not the fragmented or the distorted version of history, but the fullness of the history of race and racism in the United States that has everything to do with where we are right now in this moment in our nation, as well as the ways government-sanctioned laws have and continue to legally oppress Black and Brown people. And in terms of defining racism, as you mentioned, it's critical that we move beyond understanding racism as individual or isolated acts of hate to understanding that racism is endemic and that it works systemically, that racism is discrimination and prejudice and hate directed toward individuals and groups based on their racial identities. And it is beliefs and actions that carry out beliefs of superiority and inferiority about groups of people. And that racism is entrenched in all of our systems, institutions, because all of the systems and institutions of the country were built intentionally to exclude based on race.
Thank you for framing that. And I think about what you stated in relation to this next quote when we think about the teachings of history within educational settings. You state that words matter, stories matter, lies matter. They can influence the way we think and what we believe and how we act. So I think about that quote and teachings of history, particularly the origins of racism and the social construction of race. I think back to teachings about slavery in educational settings and how we use language to describe Africans who were held in captivity against their will, in the early 1600s, referring to them as slave instead of making the distinction that Africans were enslaved. And when we use certain terms, there are various associations that are connected to the language that we use that influences the ways in which we see people, that influences how we perceive even accounts of history. So to your point, words do matter. So I want you to unpack for us statements, such as stories matter and lies matter. What does that mean in the context of educational settings right now? Stories matter, lies matter. And what role does that play in shaping youth?
Yeah. This is such an important question. It's one that I work with educators on around the country, right? And in the United States and around the world, actually. Stories are powerful. They, as I've written in Stamp for Kids, they influence the ways we think and the way that we act. And we often see these influences and actions in relation to stories as positive, but they can also be problematic because stories have the power to also help us learn to hate. That's kind of sobering for people to think about. They're like, I read this story and it helped me in my life and it helped me to, be more courageous or to do this other thing. But also stories help us to learn to hate. And this happens explicitly through the perpetuation of racist ideas about Black and brown people, so yes, this kind of problematic nature with some stories can be explicit and implicit as a result of limited knowledge and imagination of authors about who Black and brown people are, and also by erasing Black and brown people completely from all contexts. So one thing I've asked educators to do is to create like a book collage of the books that they read in elementary or middle school or high school, books that they read, books that were central in instruction or were on the shelves in their classroom libraries or even their school libraries. And caregivers can also do this as well. Like maybe on a doc, grab the images of the covers of these books and arrange them on a document, and then make a list of your identities, your social and personal identities, the ones that were particularly important to you at that time in your life when you read those books as a young person. And then I ask folks to think about how many ways can they locate themselves in those books? What patterns can they notice? So when I do this work myself, Erica, and I make my collage, I've got books on there such as Nancy Drew and Ramona, the Hardy Boys, Judy Blume, Encyclopedia Brown, The Little Prince. I enjoyed these stories for sure. But as a young Black girl raised in a Baptist church who lived in an urban setting but had Southern roots and strong connections to my grandparents, there was a clear disconnect between me and these books. And today, students of color are continuing to experience this disconnect. And what they are learning, which goes back to your question, as a result of this is what I learned, that my stories, that my life, that my very existence was not important. And my white peers learned this too. Just as white students are learning this today, that stories about the lives and experiences of Black and brown people aren't important. Without anybody ever saying it, they're learning that. And subsequently, Black and brown people aren't important.
Yes.
And too often, stories that do include people of color, when written by white people, demonstrate a lack of nuance and care at best, and distortions and inaccuracies at worst.
Yeah. It's powerful to reflect on, and it reminds me of my own experiences growing up, where school, instead of perpetuating inclusivity, in many ways perpetuated invisibility and erasure, especially when your history, your identity, as well as narratives are not centered within a school environment.
Absolutely. Our colleague and my sister, Dr. Bettina Love, calls it spirit murdering, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is a great book as well for those who have not read We Want to Do More and Survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking about these oppressive structures, that have existed within educational settings, society, we know that oppression, when we talk about Black history, it has always been matched with efforts of resistance. We have seen strength within our ancestors, people who have pushed back against dehumanizing and discriminatory practices. There has always been resistance.
Yeah.
And resilience and strength in the face of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have learned through many Black activists has been just the power of community. I think, for example, about the Black Panther Party, from 1969 to the early 1970s, the organizing of that organization to provide a breakfast program for tens and thousands of children. Just one of the social programs that took place from that party. And then you think about other activists, Stokely Carmichael and Ella Baker, who led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s, who organized that committee and organization during a time of racial segregation within the South. And Ella Baker, whose methods I have studied heavily throughout my scholarship, talked about the importance of empowering communities, stating that if we give light to people, that they will find a way. I think about that quote all the time. And so keeping that framing in mind and really thinking about action and what that looks like in terms of dismantling systemic racism. What can we learn from Black organizers in efforts to truly create a world where liberation exists for all?
Such a powerful question, and one that I thought a lot about in writing actually Stamped for Kids, right? What I carried into that adaptation was two powerful lenses. One is awareness. Yes, I knew that I needed to help young readers develop their racial consciousness and their awareness around injustices. But I was also thinking about the Black children who would be reading that book and who would be learning possibly for the first time that there was never, ever truly a plan in this country for Black people to be fully free. And that really weighed on me. And so the other powerful lens that I thought about in adapting Stamped for Kids was the lens of affirmation. And I took every opportunity to affirm Blackness because Black children need to know that Black people have always resisted. They have always fought for liberation, not only for themselves, but for the collective. And also white children need to see Blackness affirmed, particularly in a world that tries to tell them otherwise. They need to know that Black people matter. And so I want to think about your question a little bit more, but as I'm doing that, I want to give a shout out to the book behind me, which is Kekla Magoon's Revolution in Our Time. Since you talked about the Black Panther Party, it is so incredible, y'all. Please put that on your list so that folks can learn the truth and not the myth of the Black Panther Party. But all across history are these great examples that you just gave, Erica, when teaching about slavery. For example, one of the most well-known examples of resistance is Harriet Tubman. But that's pretty much all kids learn. Students should also learn about Nat Turner, John Brown, Dred Scott. They should learn about Robert Smalls. All of these resistance stories, ways people resisted enslavement. Students should learn about the Stono Rebellion, the Amistad, and Joseph Cinqué. And learning about rebellion and resistance helps students to understand the ideas that Black people had about the meaning of freedom. And these ideas and their actions were never just about themselves. They were always about collective liberation. And the indomitable spirit of Ida B. Wells Barnett and Fannie Lou Hamer are not for us to just admire and remark about the bravery of these women and the other people that I've mentioned. Instead, we can learn what actionable steps really look like in the work of equity, what it means to be informed about issues, what it means to help others become informed, how to galvanize communities to action in various ways, through writings, through speaking, through protests, through marches, through political involvement, through artivism. And I think the most powerful thing that students can learn from the ideas of Black people is that the fight for liberation is for the good of the collective, and that a commitment to equity is a commitment to action, that justice and equity isn't just something that has ever just been given, right? Therefore, injustice and inequity must be confronted,
yes,
and challenged. We cannot simply just wish this away with passivity, with ideas about kindness, with apathy or silence. So I think that is critical for young people to study the actions of and the resistance of Black people.
Yes, and I love the emphasis on having the commitment to actions.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just standing in solidarity with people, it's moving in solidarity.
Yes.
It's not about holding the signs and changing your profile pic to show that you are with a community. It's being in community with people, listening to their voices, centering those voices, and using their voice to make collective changes within a community.
Yeah.
And I also love how you talked about demystifying our history as far as some of the false narratives that are out there about Black organizations, such as the Black Panther Party. Many people do not know that the federal free breakfast programs that we have in schools today, influenced by the Black Panther Party.
That's right.
So there's a lot of learning and unlearning.
Yes.
That we all have to do.
A lot of learning and unlearning. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the political landscape right now. And you talked about this in your introduction, that we are seeing a wave of intentional acts to prohibit as well as censor conversations about race within educational settings. Critical race theory, the big buzzword and boogeyman that we have heard so many people using across this country. And in many states now, there's legislation that has been enacted where we now see stories such as Ruby Bridges' narrative and biography being removed from schools, as well as course requirements in some states that no longer allow for students now to discuss the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And here in Indiana, we are immersed currently within legislative sessions that will censor conversations about race, as well as anti-racist training and practices that educators should engage in to disrupt the disparities that we are seeing in educational settings. And all of this due to this narrative of discomfort. Particularly when predominantly white individuals have testified, they have explicitly stated that their students may experience guilt for the atrocities of the past, and they want to shield perhaps children from that discomfort. And so I want to lean into that conversation more because our educators, many parents, many advocates are feeling the weight of legislation across the country. The racist ideologies that are foundational to many of these bills. So for those who are feeling this weight, where do we go from here? As we talk about Black organizers, as we talk about collective actions, where do we go from here?
Erica, we could probably talk the entire night about the anti-critical race theory.
I know, it's like, how much time do we have, Dr.
I know. So, in 2020, I want to go back to 2020 because that was a critical moment. After the murder of George Floyd in particular, but not just Mr. Floyd, we saw Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, murdered, there was this concerted effort to address this thing that we've all inherited, and that thing being racism, right? We saw this push to buy all the Black books. You couldn't get a copy of How to Be an Anti-Racist or Stamped from the Beginning, or So You Want to Talk About Race, or We Want to Do More Than Survive. Like, all the books were gone, right? You couldn't get copies. White people in particular purchased these books in mass. And not only that, we saw folks mobilizing into reading groups, into book clubs, to talk about what for many people was eye-opening. Finally, a recognition of what Black and Brown people have been experiencing their whole lives. And people wanted to talk about how the ideas in these books could help them make transformative change in society, right? So let's frame 2020 in that way. My former professor, friend, mentor, scholar, Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz, says, a racist system always seeks to correct itself. So then came 2021, and we saw the system seeking to correct itself. And it continues into 2022. We've gone from buy all the Black books to let's ban all the Black books. We see policies and laws being passed in efforts to deny, to silence the truth about race and racism in the United States. And here's the thing. It's now time for us to put all those ideas that folks were developing in 2020, those big ideas, it's time for us to put them into action, to demonstrate what this looks like in our daily actions. It's time to align our actions with what we say we value. And we must absolutely confront these laws and policies that are attempting to erase Black history, to prioritize white comfort. As we've discussed tonight, I was a classroom teacher for 20 years in a white, predominantly white, affluent district. And what I experienced is, yes, my white students felt bad when they learned about racism and oppression. What other emotion should they feel? But they didn't feel guilty. What they felt was empathy. Why wouldn't we want students to feel empathy for their fellow human beings? And what we're seeing is the empathy that students feel being weaponized. Because I believe that ultimately white parents who are participating in this process of denying and silencing the truth, they're the ones who are uncomfortable about what they will say when their children learn the truth and ask, did you know about all this? Right? Did you know about all this? And what are we doing to stop this? Because if parents have answers to this question, children won't feel guilty. Children feel guilty when they feel powerless. So if parents are able to say, in our home, we believe in equality, and this belief shows up in our daily lives in these ways. We work to make sure we have a diverse racial and cultural circle of people in our lives, because when we truly know one another, we care about each other. We learn the histories and the lived experiences of people, not reassuring narratives, but yes, the unsettling truths about history by reading books written by people of color. We go to museums and events. We work in solidarity with groups who are experiencing oppression by speaking up, by voting for those who will fight for the interests of those who have been marginalized. If adults are able to demonstrate the ways they're helping to create a more equitable and just world, children respond to that because children innately want to stand for justice. So our children's ability to see the world for what it truly is and to instead dare to demand that things be different is exactly what those supporting these anti-CRT laws and book bannings are looking to prevent. So for educators feeling the pressure of CRT, it can be helpful to do a couple of things. And let me know if I'm talking too much about this, but I talk about this a lot in my work with educators. It can be helpful to do a couple of things. First of all, practice your response to the resistance that you can absolutely anticipate whenever we do the work of equity, right? Whenever equity is centered, right? So what's happening now is the latest iteration of trying to halt the work of equity. You can form equity teams in your schools and in your districts and work with parent and community groups to develop an action plan that includes some short and long-term goals for advancing the work of equity and anti-racism. Teachers and leaders need to be clear about what critical race theory is by becoming intellectual activists who read, right? Who read the scholarship of those who developed CRT. This doesn't mean you have to go get a degree, y'all, or another degree. It just requires a willingness to actually read rather than repeat inaccuracies and lies by those who are least invested and most resistant to advancing the work of equity in the first place. I don't want educators to sacrifice their jobs, but I do want you to sacrifice your comfort. Now is not the time to do nothing. Talk to your teachers' unions, talk to your colleagues, talk to your neighbors, operate from within your sphere of influence and consider what's right beyond it that you can strategize toward. There's a lot we can do. Ultimately, the question is, do we have the will to do it?
The will.
Do we have radical will, right? To operate from a truth-telling stance. Do we have research and data in our back pockets so that we can cite national organizations that are revealing systemic racism at work? Have we connected with national and community-based organizations?
Yes.
We can write letters, right? We can call representatives. We have to be ready. We have to be strategic. We have to be organized. We have to be louder. Because CRT is not the enemy. Racism is.
And that is making it clear. I am so grateful for that perspective and also proud to work in a district that has also made that stance very clear in terms of where we are with current legislation, where we stand in terms of all the anti-CRT rhetoric. We are here to affirm students. We are here to create equitable environments. We are here to create a space for all students to thrive and achieve. That's our focus. And all the strategies that we are going to partake in that align with our district strategic plan to get there, that's our goal and mission.
Yes.
That's where we're centering our work.
Yes.
I love the framing and want to go back to something you had stated. It's not guilt. It's empathy. And you mentioned how our students are inherently wired to seek justice.
Yes.
And so I want you to speak to this question that comes up quite often in probably any DEI training I've ever been a part of. Are students too young to talk about race? We often hear that students need their innocence protected. And I want to delve into this, and I know you know I already know the answer, but I love for your response here. What is problematic about those statements? We say that students are too young. We don't want to squelch their innocence. What's going on there?
Yeah. Oh, so many problematic things.
Yes.
The first problematic thing is that when this statement is made or the question is asked, how young is too young to talk about race? It's white children that folks are talking about, because this is an absolutely ridiculous notion for Black and brown children who have not had a choice and learning about this from the time they were very young. So what we're doing is centering whiteness rather than those who are most impacted by racism, and that would be Black and brown people. Black and brown children experience racism as toddlers, as preschool age children. And if Black children are old enough to experience racism, then white children are old enough to know about it, right? The second thing that's problematic is that research does not support this idea that there is a too young age for children to talk and learn about race. Children are, in fact, not racial innocents. Research show that infants recognize race as early as several months of age, and that children enter schools as early as preschool, already having an understanding of the racial hierarchy that exists in the nation. The third problematic thing is that when adults take this color evasive approach, where they are pretending to choose not to see race, that's pretty convenient, right? Because if a person chooses not to see race, then they're also choosing not to see racism. And when adults ignore this, children are left to make meaning of this on their own. And what do they have to draw from? The racist smog that we are all breathing in. Therefore, we run the risk of young children developing racist ideas. They may, as Dr. Kendi says, believe that white people have more because they are more, and Black people have less because they are less. So the goal should be for all of us to have meaningful conversations with children about race that's on their level. And the reality is that young children are absolutely able to understand complex ideas.
I agree 100%, particularly as a Black woman who experienced racism very early on in life. My parents were forced to have the conversation with me by the age of 5.
Yep.
So we certainly need to have these conversations early, because if students can experience racism at an early age, then we need to start the conversation as well.
Absolutely.
During the early phases of childhood.
Yeah.
Speaking of the conversations and how to navigate those discussions.
Yep.
Yeah, I have been in a lot of spaces, as I know you likely have as well, where families want to know, where do I begin to have this conversation about race? How do I frame it in a way where my child can adhere to it, where it's developmentally appropriate? How am I able to navigate these conversations with youth? And does that conversation look different in terms of navigation between white families and families of color?
Yeah. I think there are commonalities as well as nuances. I think all parents can be teaching their young children about melanin. If a 4-year-old can say Tyrannosaurus Rex, they can say melanin. And we can just go ahead and demystify why there are different skin tones by discussing what melanin is and what melanin does. And too often with young children, adults lean all the way into the whole sameness idea, and they kind of silence difference, and therefore as by default, difference becomes synonymous with bad in children's minds. And so we can teach children that difference is beautiful and powerful, and that we are all unique. We could start there with young children. Yes, let's acknowledge that we all have different shades and tones because we're all different and unique and powerful and beautiful. Too often, the burden of having more critical conversations about race with children have fallen on the shoulders of, as we've been saying, parents of color. In fact, many white educators that I work with often say they don't recall having conversations about race with their parents at all, right? And a few years ago, I think it was NPR that did a survey of like 6,000 parents in the nation, and it revealed that same pattern: white parents not talking to their children about race. So all parents should take part in that responsibility. of helping children develop their racial consciousness to become aware of the way racism works. There's a beautiful book I want to just give a shout out. It's called Our Skin. It's on my desk. A First Conversation About Race by Megan Madison and Jessica Raleigh. And the illustrator is Isabel Rojas. Great book that can help with this. So that kids can learn how racism works as a system. They can develop some racial literacy so they're able to identify when racism is happening, interrogate it, and interrupt it. And I think to address your question about what does this look like for parents of color versus white parents, I think some of the most important work parents of color can do is to affirm children's racial and cultural identities by helping them to learn about their background and their heritage, their cultural ways of knowing and being in the world, and to see these as assets.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In order to develop a sense of pride in their heritage. And they'll need to make sure that their children's identities are not located solely through the lens of oppression and marginalization. And white parents, we're going to need you to talk about whiteness and white supremacy. And please understand that none of us are talking about or teaching about race and racism if we're unwilling to talk about whiteness. We need white parents to do this work as well, to teach children that being white and subscribing to whiteness are two different things. That means that we need to understand and name whiteness, the idea that the values and norms of white people should serve as the standard by which all other groups of people should aspire to. In order for white children to develop healthy racial identities where they do not feel a sense of entitlement or superiority or move through the world unaware of the racialized experiences of others, they have to be taught that they do not have to align with the ideology of whiteness, and that they are absolutely important in the work of creating a more equitable world. And I think, again, going back to some of the work for all parents, it's critical to teach children that being in solidarity with one another is a demonstration of the greatest sense of our humanity.
It's powerful. So powerful. At this time, I do want to take some questions from our viewers today. We are so appreciative of all who were able to attend, and we will go through the questions now and filter some of them. Would love to hear some of your thoughts if you have questions to place into the chat. One thing I have heard throughout this entire conversation, Sonya, has been just having a list of all the books that you have named. And so perhaps we can work on that following the webinar and can post it on our district website or web pages and so forth, because I do think people want to get their hands on some of the recommendations you were able to provide this evening.
Yes, I am happy to work with you on that, and then we can share that out to everyone. And I want to just say that we have to do more with the books. So we can't just get the books and say, check, I've got the books, I've got my diverse books, or whatever it is that folks are trying to call them. That's another night. We'll talk about that. You have to do more with these books,
Yes.
Right? You have to use that book as a tool for having the kinds of critical conversations that we're having right now.
Yes, we talk heavily within our corporation. It's not about having the books on the shelf. It's being equipped to have the conversation.
That's right.
Looking at the questions, there's one from a PTO president within one of our elementary schools, Fox Hill, who would love to bring this conversation to their school in the future. How can they offer similar conversations? What could that look like to invite a community to come together to have a critical dialogue about race? I think that's a bigger question around the organization, the framing. What could that look like?
Yeah, I will tell you about the kinds of, I think this is a great model that you have created tonight, Erica. And I think, in terms of places that I've been invited to, that tends to look like just having a parent night or a community night where we're inviting folks to show up, where we can have conversations about race and racism in districts where maybe not a lot of this work has happened. We're going to want to have some community agreements so that these conversations can be productive and efficient. And I just think that communities, whether they are PTSAs, if they are equity teams, we have to identify what are the needs of the district. What does a community need? And then find the individuals that can come and help support that learning and that growth. And I think these evenings are incredibly powerful. I've been invited to speak with parents in all white districts, in predominantly Black and brown districts. And there are different kinds of needs around the work of equity and race and racism. So that would be to identify what are the needs of our community and to just have a night geared toward addressing them.
Excellent. There was a question about critical race theory earlier within the chat, asking whether or not schools from a K-12 standpoint teach critical race theory. And the response would be no, not to the level of depth at all within elementary or secondary settings as it is taught on a collegiate level. And I can speak to that as an adjunct professor who has taught critical race theory courses and know that it is a critical analysis of race, laws, and power that is not analyzed to the depth at all on elementary level. So when we talk about this anti-CRT movement, we have to understand that it's really not about critical race theory, but it is about hindering conversations related to historical truths and conversations about race in general. And educators know best that there are students who will bring up their lived experiences in the classroom. You talk about who you are. And so we cannot hinder conversations about students' lived experiences within the classroom, which is why, as a district, we created the joint resolution opposing House Bill 1134. It's so important to create affirming environments. In order to do that, we can't leave race out of the conversation. Speaking of legislators, there's another question that came up, and I know we talked about community organizing and how we work against current legislation or what is happening on a national level. But what would be your advice as far as specific approaches to policy makers, who have blatant racist ideologies and beliefs about Black and brown children? Prime example, within Indiana, we had a senator who said yesterday within legislative hearings that Black students are not excelling or they're failing within the state because of, one, poverty is what he named, and secondly, due to a lack of respect for learning. So when you have people in positions of power make those claims, and they are putting essentially their beliefs into the decision-making of the creation of laws that will ultimately impact communities, where do you go from there?
Yeah. I think it's challenging because often the people who are in positions of power, who are making statements such as that, one that you've just shared, are ones who are perpetuating the kind of, discussions, if you will, about education that are incredibly problematic and have been problematic. And that is this notion of, an achievement gap, if you will, And the idea that an achievement gap exists because of the reasons of you just stated, which are absolutely egregious. And there are so many scholars that have written and talked about the achievement gap being racist ideology, right? And it comes from these various notions, these socioeconomic explanations that the challenges of Black and Brown children that they experience in school is happening because of income, because of poverty. Sociopathological explanations, the idea that they don't respect school or learning. Genetic explanations, right? The most egregious of all, that there's something biologically inferior with Black and Brown children. Cultural explanations, that there's a mismatch between school and home, rather than the work to build a bridge, right? All of these, myths about children and education. And so what we need to do is to look into the scholarship of people who've been studying Black and Brown children in schools for decades and decades and decades. So if we look at what Gloria Ladson-Billings says, and she calls it really not an achievement gap, she said it's an education debt. We need to be focusing on what is owed, and kids are owed back pay because of the historic discrepancies that they faced in education. So we need to be looking at scholarship around culturally relevant and sustaining teaching and practices if we really want children to thrive in schools. And so what we have to do when we have legislators who are saying these egregious things is we have to make sure that we're armed with some of this scholarship so that we're able to talk back and to push back around it.
I know we are getting close to time, and there are a lot of questions that are coming up in both the Q&A as well as the chat for panelists. So I appreciate the questions. And one that I'd love for you to speak to, Dr. Sonya, when it comes to validating the lived experiences of children of color, who may face biases as well as daily challenges for just existing in their skin. What advice do you have to parents when we talk about sustaining the spirit of our Black children?
I think that's one of the most powerful things about culturally sustaining pedagogy, because it asks us to be very clear, to ask the question, what exactly are we working to sustain? Whether it is language, whether it is, just our history, right? All of the things that make, us who we are. What we can do is be very clear about asking that question in our minds and then setting our intentions to making sure that we're doing that in the books that we buy and read together with our children, in the places that we frequent and visit. Just in the ways that we move through the world. We want to make sure that we are steeping our children in affirmations that absolutely make them feel loved and cherished and seen and validated, and that let them know that they matter.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. I think the conversation was powerful. We still have a lot of questions coming in. And so I'm going to intentionally take the time to stay after this webinar to collect those questions, and we can develop a resource that we include as a part of this webinar link to our DEI parent resource page, because I do think a lot of these questions are valid, and it just shows the hunger to have more of these conversations, to have spaces for learning. And I appreciate you for creating a path for us to engage in these conversations courageously as well as unapologetically. Thank you,
Well,
Dr. Sonya Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for creating this platform. And I have to give a shout out on one more book because it's a book birthday today. Identity Affirming Classrooms. I cannot wait to get my very own copy by your very own Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera. And I just want to say congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Well done, and excited to use it in my work with educators everywhere. Thank you for
so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And look forward to seeing this webinar posted on our DEI resource page on our website. And we'll make sure to also look through the questions, and I will confer with Dr. Sonya Paul so we can formulate some answers and guidance for you as well. Enjoy your evening. Stay safe out there.